All right, so we're coming to the close of the first day of Unleavened Bread. And so as we do that, I want us to keep in mind some of the things that we were discussing this morning. That is the purpose, or the purpose behind calling us to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. To identify and to rid ourselves of the leaven that is in our lives, in our homes, in our families, yes, even in our congregation. And also to realize that the first day of unleavened bread is connected to the idea of God calling his armies out of the bondage of Pharaoh and Egypt and bringing them into his service. And so we are in a battle, we're in a war, and we are to be led by the captain of the Lord hosts. He is the one who would lead us into battle. He's the one who will lead us through the storm, through all of these things that we have to endure. And we also want to remember that these things that we remember, the Passover, the Exodus, the things that Messiah had to endure, and all the things that led up to his death, burial, his resurrection. All of those things we remember, we contemplate, we embrace the lessons so that we in this day and age can advance God's purposes in this time. So when we remember the first Passover, we remember what was accomplished. In fact, Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, to paraphrase him, he says, look back on all those things of that generation, all the things that happened to them in the wilderness, all the mistakes they made. And I would suggest that if we're looking at what they did in the wilderness, we have to take into consideration what happened in Egypt as well. But he said all that to say this: don't make the same mistakes they made. Those things were written down as an example for us unto whom the ends of the age have come. And we are to consider those things very carefully so that we do not make the same mistakes they made, that we don't fall into doubt and uncertainty and give into fear and always turn to look back to Egypt and all the things that we were familiar with there. But to put our trust and our confidence completely in that what God has started in our lives, he will be able to finish it. But we've got to be willing to allow him to finish it in our lives. So we remember these things, we contemplate these things, and we apply these things to our life. We remember the suffering of the Messiah. As oft as you do this, he said, do it in remembrance of me. And as I shared last night, to remember is not just to consider what happened, but to also to speak on behalf of those things, of what he did. In other words, to be witnesses of a resurrected Messiah, not a dead Messiah, not a Messiah who's still in the grave, but a Messiah who came forth from the grave, and he has power over all, and he sits on the right hand of the power, making intercession for us, and he has called us to be his witnesses in this day and time. And so we take that into consideration. And that also, that his death and his suffering was required that we might be redeemed. In fact, that's kind of what I want to focus on this evening. That redemption has a price tag attached to it. In fact, that's inferred in the very word redemption. It has a price attached to it. No one is redeemed without a cost. And so as we said last night, for Israel to be redeemed, someone had to die. As we took and we depleted our joy from the cup, as we went and recited the different plagues, and it led up to the death of the firstborn. For us to be delivered, for Israel to be delivered from Egypt, to be redeemed from bondage, someone had to die. In Numbers chapter 33, verse 3 and 4, Moses begins to recount the journeys of the people of Israel. In verse 3 it says, they departed from Ramses in the first month, that is the month of Aviv, on the 15th day of the first month, which is today. On the day after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with boldness in the sight of all the Egyptians. For the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had killed among them. Also on their gods, the Lord had executed judgment. So Israel is going out with boldness. There's another text that says that they marched out. It even implies they went out in columns, probably according to their tribes and camps and those things, but they marched out. It was a military parade in a manner of speaking. And they're going out with a high hand according to Exodus 12. And here it says they're going out in boldness in front of the Egyptians. The Egyptians are looking on, but what are the Egyptians doing? They're burying their dead. Because again, there was not one house where there was no corpse. And so even though Israel goes out of bondage rejoicing, It's while the Egyptians are in deep mourning. And so we could say that in this particular case, redemption was connected to retribution. God got victory over all of the gods of Egypt. And all those who tried to oppress and suppress his people paid a price for resisting the will and the hand of the Almighty God. And so, again, in this particular case, it seems that redemption is connected to retribution. And so in that vein of thought, we need to recognize that redemption typically intersects with testing, trials, and even judgment. It's always been that way, and it's going to be that way all the way to the very end. In fact, let me give you an example to underscore that point. Luke chapter 21. This is the Messiah speaking. Verse 25. And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear, and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to happen, we are not to look down. We are to look up. Lift up your heads, he says. Why? Because your redemption draws near. And so my point in reading this is this future redemption that we anticipate, that we long for, that we're looking for, that we're pining for, can't wait. We need to understand something. That time is going to be unlike anything the world has ever seen. Our redemption is going to occur in the midst of things the world has never witnessed. And according to Yeshua, since the world began, and it will never witness things like this ever again. And if we're living in that day and time, these are the things that we need to understand are part of God's plan and purpose. In other words, we should not think that we will be delivered from the wicked in a peaceful time. It will be during a tumultuous time. It will be during a time of war. It will be during a time of upheaval. The heavens and the earth are going to be shaken. The writer of Hebrews refers to Haggai chapter 2, that there is coming a day when God speaks, his voice will not just shake the earth as it did at Mount Sinai, but his voice is going to shake heaven and earth. And I have to tell you that if that happens, when we live to see that, I'm going to be freaking out. Don't look at me like you're not either. His people are gathered at the foot of the mountain, and when he speaks, they're quaking in fear. And he did that on purpose. So let's not think that, we just, kind of breeze into this and all of a sudden we're redeemed. No, it is going to be in the midst of something the world has never seen. Messiah said that. All these things are happening, but we should not look down. It might be fearful, it might be dreadful, it might be ominous. Nevertheless, we are not to look down and be downcast. We have a hope. We have a confidence. We can lift up our head. We can look up because we know our redemption is drawing near. Okay? So, we need to be willing to endure and to believe these things are true, even when the world is filled with turmoil. And we're going to have to be those who have confidence in him and in his deliverance and in that redemption in the midst of the storm. It's not going to be without the storm. It's going to be in the midst of the storm, because that is the way it has always been. And so I believe that is one of the lessons that we are to take away from this feast. Eating unleavened bread, we're purging the leaven from our lives. And I want to suggest to you that fear of man and fear of these other things is some of the leaven that we need to purge from our lives. Fear from uncertainty as it relates to how our lives have always been, the familiarity of life up to this point. All of those things might be turned on its ear and probably will. And so some of the chametz that we need to purge from our life is holding on to things that he's already determined are going to bow before his feet. The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God and of his Messiah. All this stuff is going to get shaken, and anything that is not worthy to stand will fall, and we do not need to have our confidence in things that are marked for destruction. We need to have our confidence in things that are eternal, right? Because where your treasure is, that's where your heart is, right? And so again, one of the lessons that we need to learn from this feast is that to purge the leaven might include the fear. There are going to be people who are going to, it says, their hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of the things that are coming upon the earth. Now, does that mean they literally die, or is it that inside they're just kind of falling apart? It doesn't matter which one it is. Either one of them is good. And we don't need to be those kinds of people. We need to know that he is going to deliver those who are faithful. And so the feast teaches us that all of us are going to be challenged with the test of endurance. But as we're going through that storm, we can all have a peace that surpasses all understanding. That adversity, the wickedness that we're going to have to face in our families' lives and the congregational life and just in the world at large, we can have a peace that surpasses all understanding. So, to underscore that thinking, that idea as it relates to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, I want to briefly, well, not too briefly, but I want to discuss some very interesting events, significant events that are believed to have occurred at this time of year. In other words, during the month of Aviv, but more specifically during the time of Passover, the time of unleavened bread. Some of them I thought you might find interesting, but I'm going to expound on a couple of them here in just a moment. But anyway, according to tradition, it was at this time, that is the 14th, the 15th of Aviv, this time we're in right now, that many significant events occurred. In fact, one of them, according to tradition, is that it was on the 15th of Aviv that Moses had his encounter at Horeb with the burning bush. This is the 15th of Aviv. Soon at dusk it'll be the 16th, but this time of year. And this is when he had that encounter with the burning bush, and I find that kind of interesting. I mean, it's fascinating to me to think that God already had this plotted out, that throughout history, different events that were connected one to the other would all happen about the same time, sometimes on the very same day. He's that particular, that specific. And according to tradition, 1 year later on the 15th of Aviv is when Moses was leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. Here's one I thought was kind of interesting, and a lot of people miss this. It was not during the month of Adar that Esther went in before the king. It was actually during the month of Aviv. Read it. It's in your Bible. In fact, it was on the 16th day of Aviv, which will begin here in just a little bit at dusk. It was on the 16th, and then on the 17th day of Aviv that Esther had a banquet where she hosted her husband, the king, and her nemesis, Haman. And of course you go ahead. You didn't get to do it at Purim this time, so go ahead. But it is also on the 17th day of Aviv that Haman was hung on his own gallows. Now, okay, that's just for us that this year that would be Shabbat. Shabbat would be Friday night to Saturday night would be the 17th day of Aviv. And so it's believed that that is the day that Haman was hung upon his own gallows, which is fascinating to me because if you follow the timeline of Nachmanides, who was a rabbinic commentator, he believes that when Israel left Egypt on the 15th of Aviv, they started crossing through the Red Sea on the night that began the 17th day of Aviv. And of course, by the time the sun was coming up in the morning, Pharaoh and all of his chariots were drowned. That means on the same day that Haman was hung upon the gallows, Pharaoh was drowned in the Red Sea. Very interesting. Isn't it? It is to me. Kind of gives me goosebumps, actually, to think about it. That the Father had already planned all these things. Can I just throw this out there? I am. I will not be surprised. I will not be surprised if this weekend your Haman isn't hung upon these gallows. I will not be surprised if your Pharaoh isn't drowned in the sea. I'm not making predictions. I'm not saying thus says the Lord. I'm just telling you, I would not be surprised at anything at this point, because he's that specific. All right, moving on from that, here's really what I wanted to get into. And this is going back to the idea that redemption has a price tag attached to it, and that redemption often intersects with tests and trials and troubles and even judgment, as I said. But according to tradition, it was on the 14th and the 15th day of Aviv that Cain and Abel offered their sacrifices to God. And so I want to read to you from Genesis chapter 4, verse 3. We'll go over to verse 8. And in the process of time, the Ketz Yamim in Hebrew, which literally means at the end of days. So in other words, there is a prophetic element to this. This isn't just telling us about something that happened thousands of years ago. It's telling us about things that are going to happen. And so in the process of time, or at the end of days, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering, a mincha, which is a grain offering typically. He brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. And Abel also brought, not instead brought, but Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his mincha, his grain offering, it would imply. But he did not respect Cain and his mincha. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do the right thing, won't I accept your offering as well? Cain, you know what to do. Do the right thing. But if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you. But you should rule over it. And now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. So this, according to Jewish tradition anyway, happened at this time of year. And the idea here is that Cain is out there, he's a tiller of the field, he's a farmer, he's working the field, and things are growing out of the ground. And so he takes an offering of that, a mincha offering, and he brings it unto the Lord. But it's rejected. Abel also brought of the firstlings of his flock. It's a spring lamb, no doubt. And he also brings that, but it's his mincha offering that God honors and has respect to. So what's inferred here, and by the way, this is kind of underscored by the writer of Hebrews, who speaks of Abel offering gifts and how he offered a more excellent sacrifice. What's the difference? It was seen that Abel understood the significance of the blood of a lamb, because without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. And so he approaches the Creator in the proper manner. There is the shedding of blood, but there is also the mincha offering. And so I'll boil it down for you. Because Abel understood the significance of the blood, God then honored the things that he did with his hands, that mincha offering. But Cain, he had no respect for the blood of the lamb. He was offering what he could do of his own volition, what he could do within his own power. And that's why God rejects it. But here's what I really want you to see. This has a prophetic element. The first recorded murder was between brothers. And what was the issue? The blood of the lamb. You know what's going to be in the end of days? It's going to be the same thing. God accepted the one that was offered properly. He rejected the one that was unacceptable. And so in the last days, there is going to be a dividing line between those who are offering what they feel comfortable offering, doing things their way and what they feel is proper, compared to what God has said is appropriate. And there's going to be a dividing line. And the blood of the Lamb is going to be the determining factor. And so for those who push aside and relegate the blood of the Lamb to to being antiquated. And we have to focus on, the Torah says this, and I got to do that, and I don't eat this, and that's what it becomes for them. And they ignore the importance of the lamb and his sacrifice and the blood. It's going to create this controversy. Because redemption is always going to occur in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the battle, in the midst of the trial, in the midst of all of these things. Cain relied on his own efforts. And when God did not accept that, when God did not accept what Cain wanted to offer God, then he lured his brother into the field and he murdered him. So for me, there's many lessons here, but for me, as it relates to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, here's what I glean from this. God is not the only one working at this time of year. The adversary is working overtime at this time of year. And so again, redemption is not going to come during a time of peace and tranquility. Redemption is going to come in the midst of battle. It's going to come in the midst of turmoil. It's going to come in the midst of upheaval. Yes, God is speaking. The earth is shaking. The heavens are being moved. All these things are happening, and the adversary is going to be working overtime. And so we cannot afford to put our sword down. Be careful who lures you into the field to tell you something. They may not have your best interest at mind. Another significant event that is said to have happened on the 15th day of Aviv, this day, this first day of unleavened bread. I'm going to read to you from Genesis chapter 15, beginning verse 12. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Avram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. And then he said to Avram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. There will be retribution, if you will. And afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried at a good old age. But in the fourth generation, they, your descendants, shall return here. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And it came to pass, when the sun went down and it was dark, that behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces, those sacrifices that he had laid out. And on that same day, that is the 15th day of Aviv, if tradition is to be trusted, and on that same day, the Lord made a covenant with Avram. So here's why I found this to be interesting. Of course, you know the story. Avram he doesn't have an heir, and he's concerned that his only heir is going to be this servant from Damascus, Eliezer, and how do you told me I'm going to have an heir, but I haven't seen the evidence of that. So what can you tell me? How can you help me here? And then he's instructed to take certain creatures and to cut them up and to lay them out. And so that's what it's referring to here, this covenant of the pieces. But I want you to notice that as God is reassuring Avram that you're going to have descendants, that I'm going to keep my promise to you. At the same time that he's making that covenant to reassure Avram, Avram is learning that his descendants are going to have to endure exile. So I'm making you a promise. You're going to be the father of many nations. I'm going to multiply your seed, but you need to understand that your seed is going to have to endure centuries of exile, centuries of oppression, and being in servitude to a nation that is going to oppress them. And so this is being told to him, and it's also interesting, it says that a darkness fell upon him, even as he is being promised redemption for his family. I just find that to be interesting. Redemption intersects with trial and testing and judgment and all the things that Yeshua described in Luke chapter 21. Everything's just being kind of moved out of its place. When these miracles did happen, whereby his descendants were brought out of Egypt, their freedom happened in the midst of great judgments. his outstretched arm, his mighty hand, and the upheaval and the overthrow of the gods of Egypt. And now compare that to what the prophet Joel describes is going to happen in the last days. Joel 2, verse 1 and 2. Blow the shofar in Zion and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. First of all, what is that word alarm? What does that conjure in your mind? An alarm is something, it's going off, there's a sound going off, which means what? Wake up, pay attention, be alert, be on guard, stuff is happening. It doesn't say just drift back off to sleep. Sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble. Why? For the day of the Lord is coming. So all the inhabitants of the land, I would suggest, will include his people. In fact, he's speaking to his people. And he's telling the inhabitants of the land, he's telling his people, when you hear this alarm, you need to be trembling. You need to be in dread. You need to be in fear, not of man, not of the things that men can do to you. But you need to understand that the day of the Lord is at hand. And if we're going to fear anything, according to what he told Isaiah in chapter 8, if we're going to hold anyone in dread, according to what he said in Isaiah 8, our dread needs to be the Lord. We need to fear him. And so I've been saying for a while now, I've been praying this for a while now, that the fear of the Lord would come upon his people, that the fear of the Lord would come upon this congregation, that we would all get a good dose of the fear of the Lord. Why? So that we be immobilized and just, curl up in a fetal position? No. But that we would do his work in humility and sincerity with a focus on our God is an awesome God. And we should tremble before him. We should walk out our salvation with fear and trembling because he is just and he is holy. So then, let the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, that day of redemption. Again, we don't look down, we look up, we anticipate. We lift up our eyes. For the day of the Lord is coming, it is at hand. And what kind of a day is it? It's a day of darkness and gloominess. A day of clouds and thick darkness. The sun is going to come out one day. It's going to shine and everything's going to be wonderful when we get on the other side of some things. But we have to go through the storm. We have to go through the battle. And he leads us into this. He guides us through this. And this is something that we just need to make up our minds to. We read from Peter's letter, and he said, gird up the loins of your mind. Just prepare yourself for these things. Put your confidence wholly in the revelation of Yeshua the Messiah, who he is, what he has promised. We have to set our confidence in that, but we have to gird up the loins of our mind to understand what we've been called to and what is going to happen in this world. So it is a day of darkness and gloominess. And yet it is a day that you and I are to look to and to anticipate, because when we see these things begin to happen, then we can know that our redemption is at hand. And so even though the promise delivered to Abram was with dread and darkness, the promise did come to pass. And exactly when God said it would come to pass. In fact, it's in the book of Exodus that they came out of Egypt 430 years to the day that God made that promise to Abram. To the day. He's exact in these things. That day where we're redeemed in an individual situation, that day has already been determined by him. What hasn't been determined is, are we going to hold on? Are we going to endure? Are we going to remain faithful? Believing that that day has already been set, it's already been established, and it's going to happen. That day that we corporately are going to be redeemed, the Father already has that in hand. And we just have to trust that, and we have to persevere, and we have to endure. Here's another very significant event that is said to have occurred on this very day. In Genesis chapter 32, verse 22. And he, that is Jacob, he arose that night and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of Yavuk. And he took them and sent them over the brook and sent over what he had. And then Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. And now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, that is the man with Jacob, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaks. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And so he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Yaakov, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Yaakov, but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. So take this into consideration. We know this story and we know what's about to happen just after this. But I want you to consider that if tradition is correct, this struggle, this wrestling match occurred on the 15th day of Aviv, which would become the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It would become the day that Israel was redeemed out of Egypt. And there's a whole host of other events that are tied to this particular day. But I find that fascinating, that it was on this day. In fact, to me, it makes perfect sense that Jacob, who is named Israel, is going to have to contend with his chief nemesis, who is Esau, on this very day. By the way, Esau to Jacob is what Cain was to Abel. Now, Cain, of course, he murdered his brother Abel. Esau wanted to. So again, Esau is to Jacob what Cain was to Abel. And so interestingly, it's on this day that Cain lured Abel out into a field. And it's on this day that Jacob is wrestling with this man just before he is to cross over the river and to confront his brother Esau, who, by the way, is coming to meet him with 400 armed men. You see, redemption, deliverance, salvation, it always occurs in the midst of trial and turmoil and all these things that we read about in the scripture. So then, he had to go across the river. He had to face Esau. And again, if tradition is to be trusted on this very day, in other words, he had to place his confidence in God. God had promised him, you have struggled with God, you've struggled with men, but you're going to prevail. You're not going to be Jacob anymore. You're going to be Israel. You're not going to be the one whose head is beneath his heel. You're going to be the one who places your heel on his head. That is the promise we have. So he had to go and confront Esau. And even though everything went well that day, Esau continued to be a threat to Israel, continues to this very day to be a threat to Israel. But there is a day coming, according to the prophets, when God is going to deal with Esau once and for all. That threat will eventually be removed for all time. But again, redemption, salvation, deliverance, even getting the name Israel, becoming the people that he has called us to be. It's always, these things are happening always in the midst of trial and turmoil and testing and struggle. Never when everything is easy peasy. Here's one other one that I'll read to you. According to tradition, that it was on this day that Daniel was tossed into a den of lions. Now, we've heard this story all of our lives, but let's just think back, refresh your memory. What has happened? Daniel is a just man, he's a righteous man, and there are wicked people who don't like him because the favor of God is upon this man. And so wicked people go to a naive king and puff him up and hatch this plot. They want to make it sound like they're honoring the king, but in reality, what they're trying to do is get this guy Daniel. And so they're scheming, they're plotting. And so when the king issues this edict that for 30 days no one is to pray to any other god except to the king, Daniel can't abide by that. But rather than sneaking away into some corner and closing the windows and closing the doors so no one will see him, no, he gets in the window and he prays 3 times a day toward Jerusalem. In other words, to make sure that everybody knew he was not sneaking around. He was not putting his light under a bushel. He was praying so that everybody could know that he's praying to his God. He prayed openly before those who wanted to destroy him. But there was a price tag that was going to be attached to his deliverance. because the king could not go back on his edict, as the Bible records for us. And even, these men are trying to push the king into doing this. The king's trying to figure out a way to get out of this because he loves Daniel. He honors Daniel. He has respect for Daniel. He's trying not to do this. But these men say, hey, you cannot go back on what you said. And so, in Daniel chapter 5, verse 18. Now the king went to his palace, and he spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. This is while Daniel is in the den. And then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. And the king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? And then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the lion's mouth. Our adversary is the accuser of the brethren. He accuses them day and night. He is that roaring lion going about seeking whom he may devour. But you know what? One day, our king is going to shut his mouth. I'm looking forward to that. He sent his angel and he shut the lion's mouth so that they have not hurt me. Why? Because I was found innocent before him. I was innocent before him. It's also in the book of Daniel, we have this other account of these three men who, along with Daniel, went into Nebuchadnezzar's academy. And they were offered all of the king's meat and these delicacies and the king's wine. But it says that they purposed in their heart, this is in Daniel chapter 1, they purposed in their heart that they would not defile themselves with the king's meat. And you know the story, how they went on a particular diet, and they came out looking healthier than everybody else. And these men, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, along with Daniel, they were elevated to, some very esteemed positions in Nebuchadnezzar's government. But you know how Nebuchadnezzar has the dream about the image, and the image is built, and he commands everybody to bow and worship the image. And these three men, like Daniel, cannot bow down to that image because they serve the God of gods. And so what did Nebuchadnezzar do? He throws them into a fiery pit, so hot that those who are casting them into the fire are consumed. But even though they're in the fire, there is someone, and I'll just use this terminology, the captain of the Lord's host went into the fire with them, led them through the fire. And these are men, I really want to be like these guys. I'd like to tell you that, yes, I would have done the same thing. But you don't just wake up one morning to decide, if they bind me and throw me into a fiery pit, I'm going to stand. No, that's after years of disciplining yourself and saying no to yourself and honoring God in any and every kind of situation. Being able to say no to the flesh every time that we're faced with these challenges. And then to see the hand of the Lord honor that, which is bolstering our confidence and faith, so that when we come into situations like this, that we will be able to stand. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. Maybe adversity, trial, testing, difficulty, all these things that many of you have been going through in the past, are going through right now, and all of us will at some point go through these things. Maybe the Father allows that in our lives to condition us to see, are we going to stand, or are we going to go flee? Are we going to fight, or are we going to turn to flight? Because he's going to need people, women and men, who are going to be able to stand in the day of adversity and to know that he is in control. Even though the heavens are shaking and the waves are roaring, our God is in control. And it's one thing to sing it, it's one thing to say it, but it's one day to stand while the fire is being stoked for you, to stand there and say, oh King, we know that you're a King of Kings. but we're not going to bow down to your gods. We know that our God can deliver us, but if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down to your gods. You don't just wake up one day and recite that. You have to have that, you know that in your spirit, in your heart, that even though he slay me, yet will I serve him. So Daniel, he's facing his situation here, and he goes into the lion's den. The angel is sent to shut the mouth of the lions, because he says, I was found innocent before him. Boy, it pays to be innocent before him. When you're going through adversity, do the right thing. Don't give in to the flesh. Others may be opening their mouths, but you shut yours. On the night when Messiah was preparing to go and stand before Caiaphas and the judges and all the people who were railing false accusation at him, he told his disciples at one point, he says, now look, and I'm paraphrasing this, I'm about to get real quiet on you because the prince of this world is coming, but he has nothing in me. And this is what I'm reading between the lines, and I'm not going to give him any ammunition to use against me. So I'm about to go real quiet on you, and I'm going to say only the things that need to be said. And when you see him led before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, he doesn't have a whole lot to say, does he? He closed his mouth. When the adversary is railing accusations at you, close your mouth. Because you see, if you are innocent before him, he'll send his angel and close their mouth. Also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him, and he commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. And so Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him. Why? Because he believed in his God. And so just as it was with the other three, Nebuchadnezzar said, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, here we have another king having to acknowledge that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is God. And those who plotted against Daniel, along with their families, including their children, were thrown into the den. And the Bible says that they were broken into pieces before they ever got to the bottom of the den. It does not pay to plot against God's people. Daniel chapter 5, verse 25 through 7. Then King Darius wrote, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. This is a Gentile king declaring that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God of gods, that he is the sovereign of all things, and that men should tremble and fear before him. And so again, as it is related to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it's believed that Daniel was in that den on this day. I would have to imagine that when he was thrown into that pit, even though he knew he was innocent and he had done nothing wrong, I'm sure that there was a point he had to wonder, are you going to deliver me? Are you going to save me? But he was not disappointed. He was not put to shame. And the God of Daniel was sanctified in the eyes of those people who knew that he was innocent, who knew that he was a just man. Again, I'm going to suggest something to you, that many of the tests that we've been going through, that we're going through, that we will go through, are conditioning us to kind of squeeze us and press us and to see what chametz is in there, what's in there that is unprofitable, that is not conducive to God's purpose in our life, what's still in there that needs to be purged from our lives. Because there is another test coming, and then there'll be another test after that one, and there'll be another test after that one. And along the way, he's learning, he's seeing, he's observing how we're responding to all these different things, what we're going to do, what we're not going to do, what we're going to say, how we're going to think, what is our attitude going to be in all these things. Because in the end of days, there's going to have to be an army that is conditioned to adversity, but who will not flinch at the sound of battle, because they know that the captain of the Lord's host will lead them through the battle and bring them to the other side. So then, rather than us living in dread and in fear of these tests, let's be confident of our deliverance. Let's be confident of our redemption. Redemption comes with a price tag. It's always going to be connected to adversity. It's always going to be connected to all these unsavory things. It always has a price tag. And in this particular case, I'm going to suggest to you that our faithfulness, we're going to have to be faithful. That's what it's going to cost. Messiah warned that you don't go build a house unless you count the cost first, lest you get in the midst of the project and you figure out, oh, I didn't really think this thing through. Kind of connected to that guy who set his hand to the plow, and in the midst of the plowing, he looks back. Messiah said he's not fit for the kingdom of heaven. Let's be people who are faithful, because you see, there are those who will be watching. Darius acknowledged that Israel's God was sovereign. Let us live in such a way. Let us allow him to purge from our lives those things that are unprofitable now, so that when that day comes, that he stands us before this one or that one. We puts us in this scenario where people are watching, that we will be able to stand faithful and true to him, and him be sanctified in the eyes of the people that you and I come in contact with. We are here to sanctify his name. That's why we're here. You know, a lot of people move to Nepal and Tibet to figure out what the meaning of life is. I barely got out of high school, and I can tell you what the meaning of life is. It's to sanctify the name of our Creator. It's to sanctify his name in the earth. And he has given us life in order to do that. He has given us abundant life that we can sanctify his name. He's given us that opportunity. And so then, and I'll close with this. As we keep this feast and we make our matzah crack and all of our different matzah recipes to kind of break up the monotony of things, let's remember that's not what it's all about. As we eat that matzah, let's remember that he's wanting to purge from our life things that aren't profitable, that aren't fruitful, because he has a job for you to do. He has a purpose for you to serve. He has a purpose for this congregation. He has a purpose for the body and the earth in this day. And he's going to have a holy people who are completely dedicated to his service. Amen? Amen.